Thank you, Changwan, for the introduction. We're fortunate today to have, as moderator of this event, a polymath. And I'm sure if there are questions that I can't answer, he will be able to do so. I would like to thank Barry Desker for the invitation to be here. And it's an honor to be part of this distinguished series of lectures. I must say it's a bit daunting to be speaking in the nation with the world's highest average IQs to an audience far above average, I'm sure. However, Martin Buber once said that all journeys have secret destinations of which the traveler is unaware. And I am on such a journey now. And you, this afternoon, have graciously put yourself into my hands for a journey into the past without having any idea of the destination. And I just hope it will be a good trip for you. Over the past 10 years, I've been exploring the role of the ocean, both in my study and my teaching, and I'm just now beginning to write about it. And you are giving me the opportunity to try out some of my ideas, and I'm really grateful for this opportunity. I'm offering a very large framework this afternoon, a skeleton that you can flesh out, a macro-historical approach. We can look at the ocean as an avenue for the flow of goods, people, ideas, along the only avenue for such the essential link pulling together the continents. And still today, the ocean is the essential highway for goods and resources. 90% of the volume of international trade moves on the salt water. Well, perhaps it's different here, but at home in the United States, I find so many people are unaware of this major economic phenomenon. The ocean is also an arena for struggle against nature, combat, and war. It can serve as a barrier for blockade, or as Shakespeare put it, a moat defensive to a house, a shield against an invader. Taiwan, as we know it, would be impossible without the ocean. Ocean is a source for foodstuffs, minerals of increasing interest, offering a new planetary frontier, especially the vast, unexplored deep, about which we know less than we know about the surface of Mars. The sea, as part of the human experience, serves as a source of inspiration to artists in many formats, visual, oral, and verbal. In my own North Atlantic culture, Winslow Homer, the painter, Claude Debussy, the composer, Joseph Conrad, the writer, these are people who are all whose work has been informed by the sea. Artists often see the ocean as a metaphor for the human experience. Herman Melville writes of the sweet mystery of the sea, whose gently awful stirrings seem to speak of some hidden soul beneath. The sea exercises an atavistic appeal. As primordial creatures, we crawled from it. We now reach back toward it. More than 40% of humanity lives within 100 kilometers of salt water. And this is soon to be more than 50% because of increasing urbanization. 1 out of 10 of us live at less than 30 feet above sea level, which is something clearly to think about these days. Of the world's 10 most populous cities, all but 2 lie on the coast, Mexico and Sao Paulo. The seacoast claims the top so-called global cities, London, Tokyo, New York, London and New York, successively the world's premier seaport. And if we add other candidates to the global city status, commonly assigned to the second tier. We have Los Angeles, Shanghai, Hong Kong, Singapore, all coastal. Fernand Braudel, the great French historian of the Mediterranean, identifies events as crests of foam that the tides of history carry on their backs. Events, big as they may seem at the time, the World Cup, the Hollywood Oscars, even the Great Recession of 2008. These are conspicuous, foamy whitecaps, ultimately frothy and evanescent, merely the tops of the waves. Waves are the larger phenomena. They embody momentum and patterns of movement, and beneath the waves run the currents, the less immediately perceived, the huge, submerged realities of history, like revolutions, agricultural, industrial, and I would suggest oceanic. Oceanic revolution is the framework around which I have been constructing my teaching and study over the past half dozen years or so. Oceanic revolution represents a current of phenomena, geographical, economic, political, social, cultural, running over the past 500 years, throwing up clustered waves of change, continuing to evolve, altering the course of human affairs in important ways. Oceanic revolution has given societies, even small nations, those that successfully surf these changes, an immensity of power and wealth. Oceanic revolution made the Netherlands a rich nation. Oceanic revolution gave Britain its late 19th century flood tide, control over 1/4 of the planetary land surface. And because of its maritime legacy, the United Kingdom, even now, retains a world influence in excess of its size and population. London, even without ships, remains the world's maritime capital. Stepping backward now, Atlantic initiatives, Oceanic Europe instigated an oceanic revolution that would profoundly shape human affairs over the next 500 years. The first cluster of waves in this great current occurring in the 1500s, late 1400s. It swelled when around this time intrepid European navigators discovered the world wind system and used it to open global sea routes. A thalassic regional world of separate seas became a pelagic oceanic world. European seafarers established a new stream of global interactions, motivated by religious passion, desire for access to the wealth of Asia, or silks and spices, and the spirit of adventure. And the two peripheries of Eurasia, China and Oceanic Europe, that European initiative established contacts by sea. And more significantly, by tying their homeland to the Americas, Europeans reunited humanity. Europeans gained a new sense of sphericity, an image of a whole world. The German Martin Beheim's globe, 1492, the first one we know of, was vastly imperfect in its delineation of geography, but it reflected what was known by Europeans at that time. And the globe becomes an icon, I think, for the first swelling of oceanic revolution, a new consciousness of the world, the first step towards the cultural phenomenon of globalization. Epic voyages instigated a continuing process of interaction. Atlantic people established a global presence, becoming in the early 16th century the first planetary persons. The Portuguese carried with them across the globe the first global language. and an international European body of intellectuals, missionaries, notably Jesuits, who vigorously preached and proselytized the first global religion, also introduced hitherto exotic cultures to their European compatriots. And all this unfolded with great speed. The voyages of the Genoese Columbus under the flag of Spain in 1492, the Portuguese Magellan sailing under the same flag, 1519 to 1522, a mere 30 years. 30 years, it would change the world. The Iberians were prime actors in the European oceanic experience, but the Italian maritime city-states were significant feeders, notably Venice and Genoa. These small states were the richest part of Europe at the time, highly developed in comparison with Iberia. Their compactness made for coherence, intensity, vitality, pace, the sort of thing you have here in Singapore. But their success remained regional, Mediterranean-centered, not global, thalassic, not pelagic. Geography did not favor their entry into the world ocean, but they were providers of information and advanced techniques of handling money. They were institutional innovators, government bonds, insurance, double-entry bookkeeping, bills of exchange, and, of course, the gambling casino. The word, of course, casino is Venetian dialect, and the institution originated in Venice. Venice was a knowledge center, a center for printing, translating, and publishing. So, organizational techniques and talented people like Columbus and John Cabot and his son, these were gifts of the Mediterranean to the Atlantic, and Atlantic success was as much organizational as technological. It was tools, and it was the way tools were used. Iberians created empires, but failed to invest their take productively in the motherland. They failed to chart a course for continuing success, and thus faded as principal players in international affairs. And here I think there are lessons for us today. The entire European effort benefited from intense competition. The Dutch, followed by the British, preempted the Iberians, becoming the heirs to what Southern Europe had created, but carrying it much farther in depth and in scope. In maritime affairs, what follows thereafter over the next couple of centuries was evolutionary, not revolutionary. Ships and guns got better. The chronometer enabled navigators to calculate longitude. And then a second major cluster of waves forms out of exploiting a new energy source. And the waves flow with increasing intensity. What gets underway in the late 18th century produces by the middle of the 19th century a massive exploitation of fossil energy, used to generate steam power, applied on land and ultimately at sea, for production and propulsion on the floor of the factory and in the hull of the ship. And for processing of information, the electric telegraph provides pulse for this second wave cluster of oceanic revolution. The speed of electricity liberates communications from the slow pace of transportation, truly divorcing the two for the first time in history. And thanks to the undersea cable, within a generation, we had a wired world, a Victorian internet, with the telegrapher's key as its icon. The cable providing rapid transmission of news, increasing the pace of life, gave enormous commercial and strategic advantage to those able to tap this new medium. This would be a major tool for the British and the building of their empire. Steam and electricity widened the gap enormously between the Atlantic fringe and the rest of the world. Those who had the machine and those who did not. But so few could dominate so many means an enormous shift in balances of power. If Christianity was the driver of the first wave of Oceanic revolution, a sense of cultural superiority was, I think, a driver of the second Oceanic revolution. Perhaps best summed up in the words of Cecil Rhodes. Rhodes said, "We happen to be the best people in the world, with the highest ideals of decency and justice and liberty and peace, and the more of the world we inhabit, the better it is for humanity." Steam demanded fuel, and coal was the best fuel then available in quantity, and because Britain had a rich supply of high-quality coal and an empire with a global sprawl, Britain was ideally fixed to establish a network of coaling stations to service the ships that nourished a new empire. And this enabled, in the 1830s, the emergence of the arch weapon of the new European imperialism, the gunboat, carrying blue water supremacy into brown waters. The steam-powered, iron-hulled, shallow draft gunboat, able to penetrate fresh water spaces inland. This stretched the tentacles of Atlantic presence and power globally by exposing hitherto untouchable territorial spaces to seaborne outsiders, thus creating new strategic opportunities for outsiders, be it the Ayeyarwady, the Ganges, or the Yangtze. Qing China would be a leading victim. Steam exposed the heart of China, the Yangtze, to foreign military penetration. And we can take the gunboat Nemesis as an icon for this phenomenon, built in the late 1830s in Liverpool, aptly named, fighting against sail-powered Chinese junks in the Anglo-Chinese War, so-called Opium War, 1839-1842. Nemesis, with her shallow draft, enabled herself to slither swiftly across sandbanks in ruthless pursuit of her quarry. She was like a snake in a chicken yard operating against the Chinese fleet. And Nemesis, by the way, would end her career in fighting pirates here in the Malacca Straits. When petroleum finally triumphs over coal for propulsion and diesel replaces steam, for the British, this was a major blow. Britain had ample coal to burn and to sell, but Britain had to find access to oil. This, of course, is well before the late 20th century North Sea oil bonanza. So the needs of warships of the Royal Navy became an important shaper of British foreign policy. For merchant ships, we see new cargo mixes in the 19th century, reflecting the demands of a mass market and a booming industry. Bulk cargoes, industrial raw materials and foodstuffs, and goods no longer luxuries, addictive substances in quantities, sugar, coffee, tea, chocolate, tobacco, glucose, caffeine, nicotine. Cheap transport made them uppers for the masses as well as for the privileged. And in the first half of the 20th century, you see I am getting down to the present here. In the first half of the 20th century, wars demonstrate that shipping is a vital lifeline, an essential support to manufacturing and consumption. And in the America-Japan War of 1941-45, the cutting of vital arteries supplying the Japanese home islands ensured Japanese defeat. The British talked a lot about their lifeline of empire, stretching from Gibraltar to Hong Kong, but ultimately perhaps this was more a source of weakness than of strength. The true lifeline of support for the British proved to be the North Atlantic. Flows of vast amounts of weaponry, foodstuffs, fuel, and troops were important to the Allied effort in World War I and vital to the Allied effort in World War II. And today, without seaborne trade, it's been said that half the world would starve and the other half would freeze, or perhaps here in Singapore, sweat profusely. Singapore, again, would merit the description that a 19th century British visitor had of being a freshly watered greenhouse. And so the second great wave of oceanic revolution would bring a second stage of globalization, growing global economic interdependence, and massive seaborne migrations. And in the last quarter of the 20th century, a third cluster of waves of oceanic revolution would emerge. A pattern within which we are all now moving. Some of us swimming with lesser agility than others. And this wave of oceanic revolution, as I see it, embraces several phenomena. It's a geographical shift, both economic and strategic. It embodies new tools, both complex and simple. It embraces a new logistics system, and it reflects cultural change and new sets of attitudes. First, turning to economic geography. The role of the Atlantic in the last quarter of the 20th century rapidly diminishes. And 1914 comes to be seen as the peak of North Atlantic prominence or preeminence in the world. Preeminence, I should say. The North Atlantic had made itself the global metropolis. The rest of the world served it as farm and forest, as mine and plantation. The North Atlantic was the globe's vital core. The North Atlantic was the definer of economics, politics, and even culture. And will we ever see such predominance again? Post-1945 saw the rapid collapse and dissolution of the great oceanic empires. Oceanic Europe contracted far more rapidly than it had expanded. And we saw a vast increase in the number of nation states, including, of course, Singapore. The economic shift to the Pacific was not limited to Asia. It included the Canadian Pacific and especially the American West Coast, rising to new prominence in American life. What Walt Whitman called the flashing and golden pageant of California comes to a new maturity after 1945. And of course, as you're aware better than I, East Asia emerges into global prominence. The statistics are slippery, but sometime in the early 1980s, trade flows across the Pacific exceeded those across the Atlantic. And now, reflecting the prominence of Pacific Asia, a major trans-Indian Ocean trade stream has developed. reflecting perhaps a continuing westward shift of the global economic pulse. A second geographical shift lies on the horizon, and this is the emergence of the Arctic as the newest ocean. Global climate change is making it accessible as never before, with alarming speed, I might say. The Arctic is of interest to us for two reasons. One, resources. Two, roots. The resources, oil and gas, 25% of the planet's reserves are estimated to lie in the Arctic, much of it undersea. And there is to be found a cornucopia of other minerals, land-based mostly, iron, copper, nickel, and the more exotic materials like cobalt, titanium, platinum. The bulk of these are accessible only by sea because these deposits are so remote from major settlements, human settlements. Transport costs by land would be prohibitive because the networks do not yet exist for the use of this. Routes for intercontinental traffic offer dramatic global shortcuts over the great canals, Suez and Panama. New global routes, but these will pose many problems. Arctic shipping will require special ships with strengthened hulls, extra powerful engines, and provisions against the extreme of cold that ships would experience there. Plus the fact that there's no support network along the way because so much of it is uninhabited. And yet, because of Arctic melt, this is not a question of if, but when. However, looking from this vantage point here on the equator, if the productive axis of the Earth should shift to the south, embracing India, Arctic routes would be less important, I think. And remember, of course, that China and India were responsible of 1/2 of global production as late as 1800. So the Arctic might be truly consequential only as a remote but important source of raw materials. But of course, this is yet to be seen. Second, in this third wave of change, new tools are affecting endurance, volume, and the speed of sea transport and commerce. We are seeing a compression of time and space. These tools are both complex and simple. The internet, of course, a complex tool as important at sea as on land. It delivers speed and volume at minimal cost. We have become truly a telectronic society. Electronics have conquered distance. And as for the movement of ships, recall that getting around at sea, propulsion has undergone a series of changes and consequences, going back to oar power. The Mediterranean galley, for example, had tactical advantage. With oar power, you could place your ship where you wanted it to be, regardless of wind, tide, or current. But the ship was vulnerable to high seas with its narrow freeboard, and it carried severe strategic disadvantage because boats required crews. The larger the boat, the larger the crew. The crew had limited physical endurance. It needed food and water. In reality, this was really a form of amphibious power because galleys had to put into shore regularly and frequently. Wind power meant that sail had strategic advantage over oar because sailing ships had unlimited propulsive power. They were fueled by a renewable resource of great capacity, although unpredictability. And ships could be large, much larger than oar-propelled craft. So they had storage capacity for food and water, but they labored at a tactical disadvantage. Sailing ships were at the mercy of tide, wind, and current. Next came steam and diesel power. Fossil fuels gave independence from wind, tide, and current. So ships again had the tactical freedom of the galley, but they suffered under strategic disadvantage because vessels were chained to a source of fuel for their propulsive power. But in this third wave of change, oceanic revolution, nuclear power emerges. And this is revolutionary because it could provide both tactical and strategic advantage. Complete strategic and tactical freedom. Nuclear-powered ships can move anywhere, anytime, at any speed, for months at a time. Nuclear power made the true submersible possible for the first time in history. With unlimited power, the nuclear-powered submarine can replenish its oxygen, maintain air quality and temperature, generate fresh water, and move in all weather. So the nuclear-powered ship embodies endurance, and the submarine, at least by nautical standards, embodies speed as well. Nuclear power made the undersea a new arena of rivalry and potential conflict, and enabled a new projection of power for the United States and others throughout the world. And its impact on the ocean as arena, especially the Arctic, has been profound. But with the possible exception of the icebreaker, nuclear power has been a conspicuous commercial failure. Several nations engaged in costly, ultimately fruitless experimentation. The United States, Germany, and Japan. Power plants are heavy, expensive, and therefore not commercially attractive. But the simple technologies also figure in this calculus, in the category of new tools. One such is the bulk carrier. It emerges from the demand for capacity in shipping deriving from a rapidly growing world market, and it contributes mightily to the growth of that market. We identify this with one man, an American, Daniel Ludwig, in the early 1950s, a flamboyant individual in the sense that he was obsessively and aggressively reclusive. He was not a mariner. He was a businessman given to speculative operations on a grandiose scale. His passion was making money, not spending it. He was one of America's first 20th century billionaires, secretive and parsimonious, full of barely suppressed rage. It's hard to ascertain the pleasing aspects of his personality. I've tried to learn more about him, but those who knew him simply don't want to talk about it. Shipping was only one of his enterprise interests. He took it up to manage his handling of resources. Bulk haulage was his game, and that got him into shipbuilding. He was discouraged by the high labor costs and the power of unions in the United States, and so he took his business abroad to Japan. He could lease a former naval shipyard at Kure near Hiroshima, which had been used by the Imperial Japanese Navy for building its monster super battleships in World War II. He could lease this yard for virtually nothing and have access to a pool of highly skilled, eager, cheap Japanese labor, a remnant of World War II, the great legacy, really, of the Imperial Japanese Navy. And there, perceiving the economies of scale, Ludwig began to build larger and larger, and other builders followed suit. Thus, the bulk carrier emerged of various types: liquids, solids, petroleum, iron ore, coal, grain. They carried all of these things. And this led to building merchant vessels that were 30 times the size of the largest ships in World War II. These are the largest moving objects made by the hand of man. The only ultimate constraints on size would seem to be the hogging or bending point of steel and the maneuverability of these ships. And of course, the depth of water that they demand that challenges even well-established sea lanes. Ludwig's operation became a springboard for the relocation of the core of world shipping from the Atlantic to the Pacific. And in 1956, while his company, NBC, was still operating in Japan, and a year before I happened to visit his yard in Kure, in 1956, Japan became the world's leading shipbuilder, surpassing Britain. Thus, an ancient culture of craftsmanship found new expression in shipyard and factory. And this shipbuilding was Japan's first triumph as a manufacturer selling to the world market. And thus we can say that Japan's triumph sprang from the sea. Big ships brought such economies of scale that the real costs of sea transport have virtually not changed over the past 50 years, whereas everything else has. Other simple technologies have carried huge impact. The bulbous bow, for example. In 1962, this was emerges on a tanker owned by Esso, the oil company. An obscure German naval architect named Ernst Eckert was probably the first to design, fit, and use this protruding bulbous bow. It's a bulb at the front of the ship beneath the waterline. It's visible only in dry dock. It changes the way water flows around the hull, lessening the drag on big commercial ships. This is important in terms of efficiency. It offers a 12 to 15% saving in fuel consumption. And a retrofit is relatively easy. So it had a universal impact. It did not especially favor any nation or entity or even Herr Eckert. He didn't get any royalties from this. He remained obscure. Another new tool relating to logistics as well is the box. So we have bulk, bow, and box. Someone said the world is not round or flat, but rectangular. The standard size corrugated steel container, the icon of the third wave of oceanic revolution. A space defined not in meters, but in American feet, TEU, 20-foot equivalent units, reflecting its American origin. Has been branded. It bears the name of the shipping company. Designed for the sea, it's taken to the land. It's a familiar sight to any driver on an American intercoastal highway, an American coastal highway, interstate highway, on trains, on trucks, and so forth. The container has prompted new designs for ships, new automated methods of cargo handling at the dock, seamless, global, door-to-door service, It's encouraged just-in-time delivery. It's boosted the use of the computer and the internet. This is the greatest invention in packaging since the paper bag. We don't know who that clever person was, but we do know who the inventor of the container was. Malcolm McLean, a jowly, smooth-faced, unassuming man, began his business life as a boy, young man, in North Carolina by buying a used truck to haul tobacco barrels. He started adding other trucks, but long continued to drive one himself. He was very much a hands-on kind of guy. But this trucking company became McLean Trucking, one of the biggest companies of its kind in America. Nonetheless, this trucker would be voted by a professional association to be shipping's man of the century. He was a bold man. He gave up this successful career in trucking for shipping. He saw the ocean as simply another highway, with ships working like giant tractors pulling several hundred trailers. 1956 was the first voyage of a ship containing these boxes from Newark, New Jersey to New Orleans. McLean's objectives were beautifully simple: to deliver cargo cheaply, fast, and with minimal damage or theft. It was said that before the container era, a Scottish distiller could expect, on the average, to lose one bottle of every 12 that he exported to thieves. A container would make that impossible. Now they have to steal a whole container, and that happens too, not as often. McLean made transport not only a means of carriage, but transfer. Containers brought speed at the docks, compressing days into hours, minimizing costs by creating a seamless web. And the maritime industry responded to the demands of consumer society, with ships becoming mobile warehouses, shipping from origin to destination, from factory to retailer, combining speed with efficiency for just-in-time delivery. This reduced inventory, therefore lowered costs. And this is also an American innovation. The hand of statistician W. Edwards Deming, now forgotten in the United States, but a hero in Japan, where he taught for some years. We saw huge growth of global seaborne trade in the second half of the 20th century. It reflected a healthy state of the world economy and fewer trade barriers, increasing specialization and concentration of production. And all these stimulated the need for movement, and by 2008, the world shipping fleet had grown to be 13 times its 1950 tonnage, but with fewer ships. Never have so few carried so much for so many. Maritime industry became even more international. Its organization, as well as its people, the way it operated, as well as the people who worked it, both at ports and aboard ships. One port, for example, buying part of the action in another, such as Singapore's PSA or Hong Kong's Hutchison. These are active investors in container ports worldwide. So the industry's traditionally close link with national commercial power becomes more complex in this new fusion of capital from advanced economies and labor from low-cost nations, often using third country flags, flags of convenience, flags of necessity, some say. But this makes nationality ambiguous. And in disaster, of course, it blurs responsibility. Who is at fault, ultimately? Larger ships have demanded larger ports with elaborate machinery and brought change to the culture of seafaring life. Ships now have much smaller crews, sometimes fewer than 20. And sailors no longer see the world, they see the ocean. They spend little time ashore because cargo handling is so rapid. And now ports are dehumanized. You see the machinery in constant motion, but very few people. And ports, Singapore is the exception here, but ports tend to be apart from urban centers because containers require long spaces of direct deep water frontage to which ships can tie up lengthwise, offloading, loading, stowing, with parking lots for stacks of boxes. And this is space that's unavailable in most cities. Before the late 20th century, the greatest seaports were foci for dynamic international maritime communities with distinctive character, where the merchant ethos predominated. A spirit of entrepreneurship, pragmatism, acceptance of diversity, the need to do business, generating a measure of tolerance across cultures. And the waterfront was integral to the life of the city on the shore. A raucous and rowdy home, both to a large number of workers required on the docks who lived nearby, and to the needs of the sailor when he came ashore. This was a place of economic vitality which spawned a large array of services for ships and seamen, artisans, shopkeepers, and so forth, and always dock workers. And consistently present were cafes, dance halls, bars, or bordellos. Take Manhattan, for example, which I know best. The port there is no longer the community that it was when it was integrated as part of the inner city. New York, like many formerly vibrant seaports, now furnishes only materials for the archaeologist. Often, it's only the smell of the salt water, the sight of a ruined pier, the scream of an occasional seagull that reminds us of a vanished world. A maritime culture to be found now only encased in museums and perhaps a few specialty shops. So, along with changing geography, changing tools, changing logistics, and the loss of a seaport culture, we have a series of new attitudes towards the sea. First of all, a proprietary sense, a growing sense of national ownership of oceanic space, a shrinking of the commons. 40% of the oceanic surface is now claimed either in exclusive economic zones or other sovereign control. And with uncertain and often disputed delineations of what is claimed. So the sea is becoming a source of rising international tensions. We've seen it in the South China Sea, of course, and we see it emerging now in the Arctic. Another attitudinal change is environmental. This too dates from not very long ago. A new awareness of the fragility of the ocean, brought to us by the oceanographer Rachel Carson, the American. She stirred the American consciousness with her book, The Sea Around Us, published in 1952. It was a bestseller for a couple of years in the New York Times list. And in 1957, she wrote a book called Silent Spring, which alerted Americans to the dangers of unrestricted use of DDT. Her primary message was that such is the import of 71% of the planetary surface that the good health of the ocean is essential to the good health of us all, that we must work to preserve it, and yet time may be short. Fishermen are finding fewer fish. I live in a seaport town, and I'm very much aware of this and the dissatisfaction of fishermen who refuse to believe that the age of free fishing is about to end. Scientists say that all the large species are endangered. But overfishing is only one problem. Others, which particularly pertain to ports, derive from deep dredging, sediment carrying pollution, for example, diesel fumes that ships emit even when docked. This has been a problem in Los Angeles, Long Beach. When I visited that port, I was told that the emissions from ships are a bigger problem than the emissions from automobiles. And that says a lot for that part of the country because the automobile is so ubiquitous. Ships introduce alien species, plants and animals, which wreak havoc with existing ecosystems. Undoubtedly, we are going to develop the ocean. It's in our genes to do so. The prospects are too enticing for otherwise. This, after all, is the ultimate storehouse for humanity. And as we do open this new frontier, the occasion will provide an immensity of challenges and opportunities. And it raises the ultimate question: will we be able to preserve the ecological integrity of the ocean while exploiting its resources? Upon our success or failure will hang the future of humankind. So, I've said what I want to say.